Hello, and welcome to another installment of our online educational series, Belonging Together. My name's David Joseph. Some of you may know me as DJ. I'm the facilities manager and the assistant to our head of school, Rabbi Rubin. I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening and take this opportunity to wish you and your families an early happy Thanksgiving. I hope you've all managed to stay healthy, safe, and free of calamity. I started at JCHS in 2006, the same year Evan Wilkenstein joined this community to work in the Judaic Studies and Student Life departments. Over the years, I've watched Evan grow as an educator with his contributions to student life, Judaic Studies, with EverLab, and all of his experiential educational wisdom. He's the published author of a fabulous book. It's called Turtle Boy. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. I absolutely loved it. Read it. Recommend it to your friends and members of your family. You can pick it up on Amazon, Penguin Random House, and other bookseller outlets. 2020 has been unusual to say the least, and we're about to learn how we can look to Jewish civilization for ideas how to weather calamities. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, my friend. He's the director of experiential education at JCHS, Matthew Evan Wilkenstein. Thank you.
Awesome, DJ. What a lovely intro. That was very sweet. I too have just always loved working with you and all the ways that we've kind of grown in our careers together, and that's just something I appreciate about working with you. So tonight's session together is called the Life and Adventures of Calamity Judea, which, if you didn't pick up on that, is a riff on The Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane. And I picked that title because tonight we're going to be talking about calamity. And it's not all going to be heavy. Parts of it, we will get into the murk. We'll get into the shadows a little bit. If you ever see me looking up here, it looks like I'm looking up at the ceiling like, oh heavens. But in fact, I'm looking at my other monitor, which is up here where I have my notes. So I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. So I want to start out by telling a story about one of the first times I understood what calamity might feel like in my family. It so happens that my brother nearly didn't survive birth, but he's my older brother, and by the time I came into the world and was conscious, he was just my older brother. So that was a painful experience that my parents went through. But the first time I knew from calamity was and I'll cut to the end and I'll mention that my dad is alive and well. But when my dad was diagnosed with cancer when I was a ninth grader, so the same age as many of the students that I now teach, he had a test, it came back with a diagnosis, and the family hit a period of real difficulty. And the way that I experienced that moment, the pain of it, was I experienced a constant relentless nausea and a kind of agoraphobia where I couldn't really leave home without this being stricken by this nausea. I went to see doctors and specialists, and they all couldn't figure out what physically was wrong with me. Of course, nobody was connecting the dots that the thing was wrong with me was, to use a term from family therapy theory, I was the identified patient. My dad was the physical patient, but I was the kind of spiritual lightning rod of the family, and it was all going to my stomach. It was a very dark time as a ninth grader, and I remember it being very heavy and difficult to get out of bed in the morning and difficult to sleep at night. And I call that now still the blue period. So the question is, how did I get out of that period, that calamity that hit the family? So I will tell you later, but first I want to invite from the group, and I'm going to share the prompt. Now, DJ, if you would just make sure that everybody has the link to tonight's texts. the prompt that we are going to be looking at together, I'm also going to throw it in the actual text of the prompt. I'm going to throw it in the chat. But tonight we will be using a text sheet, and the text that we're looking at is going to be box 1. But for your convenience, boom, there it is right there in the chat as well. And I'd love to hear, as you think back over your life as I just did, to consider just in your mind, let them visit you, 2 or 3 tough periods or experiences in your life. It could be now. Maybe now is a tough period. I think for a lot of us it is, or it could be long ago and far away. And my question is, as you think of them, which of these sounds most like you? A, you tried to learn as much about the situation as you could. That was your way of going through that. B, you experienced powerful emotions and you needed to get those emotions soothed, in check, or get them expressed. C, you relied on strong core beliefs. And D, you got up and you got active. And there are other solutions too. One of those might not satisfy you, so feel free to say E, none of the above. But I'd love to hear from some folks, and feel free also, if you're more of a chat type person, to throw your response in the chat. But I would love to just invite some folks to share one of those periods in your life, and which of those A, B, C, or D is the most kind of how you dealt with that calamity. And let's see what, if we have anybody who feels comfortable sharing about that. So if you feel like you'd like to talk about it, you can put a hand up. If you'd like to just put it in the chat, you're welcome to put it in the chat. Jackie, you're going to start with you. And while Jackie is queuing up, is there anybody else who would like to get on our little speakers list? You'll be our number 2. Craig, is that a you? Would you like to be our number 2? Or is that just a thumbs up to the, great, wonderful, thank you. Craig, you're going to be our number 2. And then we'll do those 2. And then if another person feels like, yes, I would love to be part of that, great. Jackie mentions that she needs to be unmuted. And
okay.
There you go. Hi, Jackie, tell us about your experience.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to move the block, but yeah. Can we have more than one answer?
For sure.
Yeah, so I'd say A, B, and C. And what comes to mind immediately actually is when my father passed away, which was 2 weeks before the birth of our first child. So it was really it was a particularly difficult time. And I would say I wanted to read every book I could about saying Kaddish and Jewish mourning ritual. I somehow thought that the more books I read, that I would have an answer to the pain that I was experiencing. That didn't really help, but I did think that. I definitely experienced powerful emotions often, and I had, I just cried a lot or whatever I needed to do. And I relied on strong core beliefs because I ended up saying Kaddish every day, and that really that really made a big difference. But that was, at the end for myself, I guess I realized that this is only for me, that the grief journey is a personal one, that I was just going to have to somehow get through it, even though I had the support of the community. I wasn't going to be able to read a book that was going to solve it for me, even though at the beginning I thought the more I knew, the more it would help me. But that didn't happen. But I did end up on the other side, and the sun still shines and I could laugh again. And, but at the time, it maybe didn't feel that way.
Thank you for sharing that. I love how when we learn together, we can go to some real vulnerable and like real places as we learn. My follow-up question, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think there's something about vocalizing it. As you look back, are you happy with that approach? Like, would you use that approach again? Would you try a different approach again? What are your thoughts on that? Good. You there?
Give me 1 second. Let's see.
Sure.
She's been muted.
Come back, Jackie.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. Sadly, when my mother passed away a few years later, I ended up saying Kaddish for her again. I had the books as references, but I didn't look at them in the same way. And yes, in that particular case, that was that worked. I mean, I would do that again in that way. That was, and I recommend it to other people sometimes if they're open, even if they don't think they're going to do it every day, to just have something to grasp onto in that way was very helpful. Yeah. Thanks for asking it.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I think number 2 is our friend Craig. Is it?
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Hi, Craig.
Hi. It's interesting to see it laid out this way. I haven't thought about this before in this way, but I think my modus operandi, kind of in regular challenges in my life, has been to just get up and start moving. And I can think of things around school and work where things didn't work out, and then I just get up and start moving and find another alternative approach. And I go through a period of grief in a way for a few days, and then things start working again. But quite different. I lost my brother, my younger brother, 3.5 years ago, and that's very different. Then B is really, it wasn't that, I mean, of course, I eventually got up and got moving, but it was really a long process of months in B, and really looking at my deeper core beliefs. Of course, the love and support of my family and friends, and then also the reality that our niece, who's now part of our family, she had lost her mother before, and then had lost her father, who was my brother. So now she was becoming part of our family. So the love for her and going through the process of bringing her into our family at the time she was 17 was also part of the healing process for me personally.
Yeah, the role of other people in our own healing is not to be underestimated. It can be powerful and really essential. Do you mind if I ask you the same question as you look back? Are you happy with the approach that you did? Would you use it again? Would you try another? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, thinking about the loss of my brother, I think that I used the right approaches and I had wonderful support from family and friends, and also from the congregation and of our synagogue and from our rabbi. And again, like Jackie was mentioning, waking up every morning and, going through and then we had Shiva in our home and going to the synagogue, say Kaddish twice a day. Those, that again, connecting with my core beliefs, but that ritual was healing. And then eventually going to the mikvah and having our rabbi actually take us to the mikvah. I'd never gone to the mikvah before. And going through that process, I felt like I could kind of emerge throughout the other side of after the mikvah and kind of move into the next phase, which obviously in Judaism, we talk about these various phases of grief, just like other traditions as well.
It's interesting that you and Jackie both, I think, use the exact same words about something like made it to the other side or got to the other side. And, in our Jewish tradition, we have multiple references to the idea of pain being some kind of a valley or some kind of a desert or some kind of a wilderness that needs to be traversed. It's not like the pain is not life, like it's a period of life, and you need to make it through it, but really powerful in the way that the symbolism of those rituals got you through that. Well, I'd love to thank you for sharing. Again, it's powerful. People, when we do these learnings together, people bring up stories about all sorts of things, and it can be really tremendous to share that and kind of feel held by the group as we tell our stories. So returning to the calamity that I was experiencing in my family, my dad's diagnosis and this mounting agoraphobia, I did some therapy. I was a ninth grader, and that wasn't really that effective. It's really unclear. But the thing that was a turning point, interestingly enough, was a quote from Mark Twain. My dad heard me unpacking a little bit about what I was talking about in therapy, but I think it was really like he needed to give it the language I needed. If you look on your text, the Google Doc, and you go to box 2, you can read with me the quote that my dad printed out at work on his Xerox printer. It was a picture of Mark Twain. I'll read it to you in case you don't have easy access to the doc, but if you do want to see it and see, Samuel Clemens mug while I read it. You're welcome to take a look at that. And it said, I am an old man and I have known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened. Now that picture, the photo of him in the quote, he gave it to me, and we were talking about how I was so overwhelmed by his diagnosis and my fear of being a ninth grader and only 3 years away from leaving home, and how I was going to manage adulthood and life and death and all those things. And he said, let's just try to remember that a lot of this is going on in your head. And I realize now, looking back at it, that option A, option B, option C, option D, I, as a ninth grader, was spending way too much time in thinking and feeling my family's pain. And this quote helped me to move away from thinking and feeling, to move to more like a belief that everything was going to be some version of okay, and also action. And that's around the time that I started playing guitar and playing Dungeons and Dragons, both of which I enjoy, although with much less frequency, all the way to this day. Met a whole bunch of new friends, and my life began to move forward in a really powerful new way. So the problem is that was then, as a ninth grader. The problem is I've lived longer now, and I know that many troubles, in fact, do happen. And pulling the camera back and thinking of our people, the Jewish people, we have known many problems, and they did happen. And in fact, misguided and hateful people say that they didn't happen. And I think you probably know what I'm talking about, with reference to Holocaust denial and so on. But those calamities did happen. And now we're looking at the world now, and there's all these bad things happening right now. So humanity, how are we going to respond to and survive and deal with these calamities? COVID, environmental degradation, disintegration of civic society, Black Friday, and I can't get socks, there's calamities everywhere. So let's turn to the Jews for clues. Jews have a long culture, a long history of unpacking calamity. So I'd love to direct you now to the text. Feel free to open up that Google Doc. DJ, if you would be so kind as to throw that link back in the chat in case anybody doesn't have it or lost it. If you have two monitors, you can separate it. If you have two screens, you can do two tabs. But we'll be looking at this text for a little while, and you can focus in on the text. And it's called box 3. Once you're at box 3 and you have the text in front of you, can you give me the thumbs up so that I know you're there? Lots of thumbs. Very good. And if you don't have a thumb up, I'll just direct you to, very good, good. So yeah, click on that link that DJ sent out. Looks like Julie did, and scroll down to box 3. So this passage comes from one of my favorite books, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. When I teach it, I often call biblical characters by their English names. I'm accustomed to that, but Yirmiyahu is one that I have always done, because when I taught it, I got so tired of my students saying that Jeremiah was a bullfrog that I started saying Yirmiyahu, just never to have to hear that again. Not a bad song. Don't need to hear my students sing it all the time. And this story is set around the time of the destruction of the first temple in about 586 before the Common Era. And what you're going to read is one of the early calls where this young man, Jeremiah, receives prophecy from God, who's very unhappy with the Jewish people. The temple is still standing, although not for long, but it's still standing. And the nutshell content of the speech I'm just going to spill the beans, that you're about to hear is something like, fix your ways like I've been telling you, or you're in big trouble. Like that's basically like the point of the speech. But it's actually kind of a longish speech. It takes much more than just fix your ways before something bad happens. And everything that you have there is just an excerpt. So we're going to mine the speech for more than the central content. And as we read, in the chat, I want to welcome you, or just in your mind, but certainly in the chat, anytime you see something about human nature and how it demonstrates humanity, like what gets humanity into trouble, or how it gets out of trouble or doesn't get out of trouble, throw it in the chat, and I'll give you an example of that. Let's start reading. So Jeremiah 26. This is the beginning of the reign of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah. The word came from the Lord. He's now talking to the young Yirmiyahu. He says, stand in the court of the house of the Lord. That refers to the temple. and speak to the towns of Judah who are coming to worship in the house of the Lord. Remember, they're going to, the Judeans, the Jews are going to be going to offer sacrifices. All the words that I'm going to command you to speak to them, do not omit anything. Perhaps they will turn back, they will listen and turn back, and I can renounce the punishment. So as an example of what I mean by like, what do you catch about like human nature? When God says, don't omit anything, what is God probably concerned Jeremiah would do if he has to say that? And feel free to grab that mic, turn on, and what do you think? Why would God have to say, don't omit anything from the speech I'm about to tell you? What do you think? I'm going to tell you what to say. Don't leave anything out, Deb. Why would he say that?
He doesn't want Jeremiah to do anything on his own that's going to distort what God is going to say.
Great. So you might read exactly. Very good. So you might, and there's other ways to interpret it too. So you might say, we learn from this that that when people have a mission to accomplish, they may distort the mission either because they have malintent or because they want it to go well and they're afraid of what's going to happen. And so they try to soften it. Sometimes as a teacher, if I have to give bad news, I sometimes am hesitant to give the full picture because I don't want it to hurt. And so I might omit some of the reality of it. God is saying, don't omit anything. Now, how about this one? Perhaps they will listen and turn back. What do we learn about humanity from the perhaps? Deb, you're smiling. What do we learn? Do you want to continue?
I would say that we only want to hear what we want to hear. And if you're not listening, you're not going to get the message, really.
Not going to get the message. Good. Okay. Very good. So let's keep going forward. I'll read a few chunks and then I'll pause, but you get the flow now. Like be listening for like, oh, that sounds like humanity. Tricky humanity. Thus said the Lord of hosts. Now this is the speech that Jeremiah is supposed to deliver. Imagine Jeremiah standing at the temple as the pilgrims are coming and he's yelling at them. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Anna's sleeping in the other room, so I'm not going to yell. So don't worry about that. Mend your ways and your actions, and I will let you dwell in this place. Don't put your trust in illusions and say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. No, 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 no. Only if you mend your ways and actions, if you execute justice between one man and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods, only then will I let you dwell in this place in the land I gave to your ancestors for all time. Now let's unpack that a little bit. What do you see happening? So Patty and Sammy are saying we don't usually listen. Well, very good. Oh, good. Those are responses to earlier. What do you make of that little chunk there? And I'm gonna, if you're looking at the text, I will bold so that you can zoom in on what I'm referring to. What do you make of this little box here?
Well, it sounds to me the way that a parent would speak to a young child.
Say more. How so?
Well, basically, the assumption is you've been bad. And so I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to explain exactly what you've done bad, but I'm going to tell you things you can't do if you want to stay in the house or stay part of my family.
Great. Want to live here? You got to wash the dishes, vacuum the floor, take out the paper and the trash, or you don't get no spending cash, right? Okay, awesome. More. Let's hear some more. What do you learn about humanity from this text? Maya! Hi, Maya. Maya, did you get the text? Did you get the link?
I didn't. I'm
okay,
sorry.
Great.
So late.
DJ, will you give Maya the link to the text, please? Thank you. And Maya, as you're joining us, we are in box 3.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As people come in, if you can reshare that, that would be great. Okay. What do we learn? What else do we learn from that section? What do you make of any hands? I don't want to interrupt.
Sure.
Ruth, hi Ruth. What do you learn
Hi.
from that box?
I don't know. I mean, I'm also a teacher, and maybe that you have to be really specific and not you know, with what you are asking, and or people can just interpret it their own way, or
their own way. What words are you picking up as really specific?
well, just the whole specific list, like if you
Mhm.
execute justice, then express and the
Sorry,
orphan
sorry.
and the widow,
Great.
you know, like not just like, oh, only if you be good.
Right.
Or-
Right. Don't just be good. Here's a list. Do I have to spell it out for you? Apparently I do. Here it is. No, I'm curious what
I had a-
you, I'm
I had
curious what
another-
folks,
Sorry, I
what?
just had another thought. I was just looking at
Yeah.
the verbs. They're all action words. They're not like, don't believe this, don't think
Yes.
this. It's all action words, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll use that as a to zero in. Jackie, tell us about illusion and what this temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord. Like, why is he talking like that?
I think he's saying you need to do what's real. Don't do just what you think you want. I mean, there's so many contemporary parallels, Evan. I'm just kind of knocked off my socks thinking about it at the moment.
Yeah.
But, you know, you got to do the real thing, not just, don't be deluded into what you think is right.
Right.
This is what you need to do.
Right. And and I think what God is letting us, or what the text is letting us know, is God is saying, like, look, people, all you talk about is the temple of the Lord. Temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord. Like, God is like, let's stop talking about the temple. Let's talk about what your actions are going to be. And as he goes on, he says, you're kidding yourselves if you think that the temple is what this is all about. Because he says, now I'm on line 8 and 9, you're relying on illusions that are of no use to you. You steal and you murder and you commit adultery and you swear falsely and you sacrifice to Baal and you follow other gods. And then you come and you stand before me in this house with my name and you say, we're safe to do all these yucky things. No, feh. I added the no feh. That is a phrase that needs to be brought forth in my life more often. My grandma used to say that all the time, and I feel like I need to say it more often. Also, yucky is my own translation. But basically, like, what we're learning here is that the people think they are safe from danger because what do they have? The magical, mystical temple. And God is like, that is just a building. That will not do you any good if you do not have a relationship with me where we follow the covenant that we promised. So he goes on in this beautiful moment of biblical sarcasm. This is one of the best moments of sarcasm that I've ever seen in the Bible. I think it's one of like 5 that I've like been like, that is sass right there. This is God sass. God says, you know what? Why don't you just add your burnt offerings to the other sacrifices and eat the meat? Meaning, like, eat your own barbecue offerings, because when I freed your ancestors from Egypt, I didn't talk to them about burnt offerings or sacrifice. I told them to follow my covenant, but they didn't listen. Now, Jackie, you mentioned earlier about how like the contemporary parallels. Now, just listen to the language here. But they didn't listen. They did whatever they wanted. They followed their own counsels. They've gone backwards, not forwards, right? Not progress, but doing things how we used to do them. And I kept sending my servants daily and persistently, and they would not listen, and they stiffened their necks, and they acted worse than their predecessors. And you say all these things to them. Pause there. Okay. So we have a tendency, clearly that has not changed, that we continue along doing the path of whatever we want, and we don't listen to the people who warn us. Now, God says to Jeremiah here, you're going to say these things to them. They're not going to listen to you. You're going to call them. They're not going to respond to you. And I will silence the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, and the whole land will fall to ruin. Bah. Whew. So we reading Jeremiah, because we don't live in the future and we don't know which way the story is going to go. We hope it's going to work. He gives his speech. Fast forward, let's see what happens. One line down, it jumps a bunch of chapters. They take Jeremiah and they put him in a cistern, which is where this is like an underground cave for like rain runoff. And they lower him by ropes and he sinks down into the mud. Oh, that is what we like to do with the people who tell us the ugly reality of what is happening around us. So, if you if you scroll down a little bit, when I used to teach this text in Atlanta, I actually had a student build for me a yoke. This is the yoke that Jeremiah would carry around to demonstrate that Israel needed to yoke itself to the covenant and not to doing whatever it wanted to do. Look how fat that tie is. What was I thinking? Okay, anyway, times have changed. So the moral of the story, my friends, you're welcome to join us back on the Zoom window. I'm just going to speak for a minute. The moral of the story is that when calamity happens, we look around and we point fingers, and we see that the culprit is we. The culprit is us. We is the culprit, and we've been acting like humans for a long time, and we need to fix that. But the thing is that human nature seems to be human nature, and this text is from 2,500 years ago, as Jackie pointed out. It might as well be talking about any number of things today, and it remains to be seen whether we're ever going to get our act together, or whether we're going to burn down our own temple worldwide, so to speak. But the warnings are powerful, and if they haven't fixed the problem, right, the Bible did not fix the problem, at least it's inspired many agents of change who've looked into the biblical prophets for inspiration and for a sense of fellowship and purpose. But what about us? So we've seen how everything from the pandemic to the wildfires, systemic racism are not any one person's fault. They are everyone's problem, and they are everyone's responsibility. But we started our talk today a little bit more personal. What does Jewish civilization teach us about calamity in our lives, the pain as we experience it? As far as the Tanakh is concerned, the Torah is, in case you didn't know this, the Torah is not loaded with comforting, feel-good passages to help us weather the storms of life. Sorry to break that to you. And neither do the narratives of the Bible from the golden calf on, all the way to the destruction of the temple. There's lots of warning, there's lots of misbehaving, there's lots of suffering, but there's not a lot of comforting. One would hope, and I think we know though, that Jewish civilization doesn't end there, right, with this destruction of the temple. In fact, it's understandable that so much of the Bible is about the calamity of the destruction, because when the Tanakh was written, that was one of their main problems. Like the Jews of the time were like, oh no, if we have this covenant with God, how did this happen? How was our temple destroyed? So a lot of the book is about, well, you did these things and you did those things. It was trying to help them make sense out of the trauma of the temple being destroyed. And as we've discovered, a lot of wisdom comes out of it, all the ways that we resonate today, but not necessarily a lot of comfort or practical advice or inspiration. But for that, we can turn to unfolding Jewish civilization, which needed to be helpful and motivating and effective in order for Jews to just survive into eternity, right? Not just in the ashes of the temple. They needed one thing then 2,000 years ago, but for all the future calamities that lay ahead, national, but also personal, right? Each of us has those moments. So I'd like to suggest here that Jewish civilization, we got it covered. We talked about those 4 different responses to trauma or calamity or challenge earlier, but I'd like to draw your attention now back to the text. And DJ, if you want, you're welcome to throw that back in the chat again, but if you have that tab, join me over there to box 4. Now, this graphic comes to us from Roni Ben David, who is one of JCHS's most powerful agents of change and growth in terms of opening up our eyes to what we can do to dismantle systemic racism in our world with fantastic and challenging programs. And she brought an organization that showed us this 4 quadrants, 4 different ways that people tend to respond to painful challenge. We take the intellectual approach and we think. We take the social approach and we do. We take the emotional approach and we feel, or we take the moral approach and we believe. All of those are good. The problem is that we tend to do one or 2 of them to the exclusion of the other ones. And sometimes we don't fully embrace all of them. And we may use the one that we're comfortable with over and over again, neglecting some others. So I want to talk a little bit today about other modes that Jewish civilization has for helping us deal with calamity and pain as it's happening. This feels very relevant to me right now. Besides everything that's happening in the world, my best friend's mom has COVID. And right now it's not clear. I don't know if she's going to make it through the week at this point. So there's really a lot going on right now in the realm of feelings and calamity. And so putting this together for us tonight was a very like real thing for me. And each of us, when we're confronted with something that requires courage, we lean one of these ways. But let's look at something comforting and reassuring. So this goes to the quadrant of feelings. I'm feeling pain, I'm feeling grief, I'm feeling anguish. Actually, I am feeling those things. So what does our civilization have to offer? So Parshat Nachamu comes after Tisha B'Av. That's the most upsetting day of the year, the destruction of the temple. After that comes the Parshat of Consolation, when we have some beautiful language, and I'd like to direct you to box 5 to have a peek at it. Actually, I'm going to, take a look at box 5. Look at the language there. Comfort ye, my people. All right, thank you. Yeah, I don't know whether that breaks my heart or makes it feel whole. A little of both. God, if the Hebrew was already beautiful, hearing it sung through the lips of a Portuguese speaker. Portuguese is already one of the most beautiful languages on earth, and hearing it give soul to those ancient words, I find that very, very powerful. So one thing I wanted to add to that is, before we move on to our next mode, is the way those words can help us to feel in our anguish, either held or amplified or in the company of others with feeling. The Jewish Chronicle, I was doing some reading about Nachamu, and they brought this little nugget that I'd never heard before, but I think it's powerful, that Rashi looks at the word Nachamu. And he says every time, Rashi, the medieval French commentator, and he says every time the word nachama comes up, which I usually think of meaning just comforting, Rashi says it always involves having a machshava acheret, a different thought. So the Chronicle says this is the common thread linking regret or anguish and comfort, thinking differently about a situation. Comfort begins when we can reframe the immediate pain of a loss in a larger, more encompassing picture or story. I'll say it again. Comfort begins when we reframe the immediate pain of a loss in a larger, more encompassing picture or story. And I'm struck by how those of you who told stories about the loss of a loved one at the beginning of today or tonight, and the way that you talked about, how the larger story and how it continues, and that painful moment takes its place in the context of a larger story. Whew, okay, deep breath. Now we're going to change gears. And we've talked a little bit about thinking and believing already with Jeremiah, with Yirmiyahu, and with Nachamu, with feelings. We also have a rich history, very rich history of writings which marry intellect and messages that penetrate to the heart. Nobody does that better than Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I think is my superhero, among others. I'd love to invite you to look at box 6. We'll be hanging out in box 6 for a while. Heschel on stuff very relevant to right now, I'm calling that section. And as we're reading, if you see a passage where you're like, oh, whoa, and you just are struck by it or perplexed by it or moved by it, throw that line right in the chat. And then when we're done reading it, we'll just hear some reactions and see what you think. Okay, Heschel on stuff very relevant to right now. I have 2 little tiny quotes and then a longer passage. He says, God's mercy is too great to permit the innocent to suffer. Okay, so far so good. But there are forces that interfere with God's mercy, with God's power. This is a dreadful mystery as well as a challenge. God is held in captivity. God is held in captivity. That's pretty striking. He then says in a different section, God participates in his creature's suffering. I'll quote for a moment my professor, Emil Fackenheim, who I studied philosophy with at Hebrew University, would talk about this line and said, if God is infinite and God can suffer, then it means that God suffers in a way that is infinite. And I don't even know what to do with that. I don't even know what to do with that. But Heschel goes on. Now, this text is from the passage is from a text called On Suffering, and Susanna Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel's wife, found it after, I believe, posthumously, and it was written in, if my memory serves, in German, and he did most of his writing in English, so it stands out as unusual. And as somebody who fled the persecution of the Holocaust, closer, I think, to the suffering that he was close to. He says, suffering confers neither a patent of nobility nor an obligation to purify oneself. And I think he's referring there to other religious systems that glorify suffering in and of itself. He says it is a task that some may fail. Suffering is a task that some may fail, but which could also be one's salvation. How is this task to be met? What can we create out of suffering? To experience the intensity of one's own pain is not the meaning of suffering, but a sign of danger. Now here he goes. To be immersed in pain can lead one to the prison of the soul or to the freedom of community. It is left to the suffering person to recognize darkness or light. Great and minor suffering, loss and unhappiness, deprivation and defeat, these lead us to the kingdom of true life, to community with others in harmony with God. In suffering, one experiences friendship, community, and God. The path to community leads through personal suffering. Now, remember before we talked about how suffering was like this valley or this desert or this rough patch that we made it through. Here he's saying the path to community leads through personal suffering. What's on the other side of suffering? Community. Suffering is not the goal, it's the path. It's narrow and steep between the abyss and the peak. An ever clearer view of humans and animals, of all creatures who are our brothers in suffering, it almost sounds Buddhist, is revealed to one who makes the ascent from pain and torment. Down there at the bottom of that abyss of pain and torment, as you climb out of that, he's saying, you have this clearer view of the suffering of the world. It's very Buddhist, actually. All beings encounter one another on the paths of suffering, and we also encounter him who is with us in suffering. Whoa, on the path of suffering is where we bump face first into God, who's making his way on the path of suffering towards us. We have to be careful not to find a home in pain and drown our thoughts in feelings. There's that quadrant, right, of feelings. We should not enter into the maze of meditation on justice and injustice. Nobody talks about justice like Heschel, and he's saying he knows justice, and he's like, don't get trapped in the maze of talking about justice. The task is given to the suffering person to direct himself to other suffering people, to see them in the fire of his own suffering, to see for others near and distant. Suffering breaks the circle of egotism in which our heart has been confined. The revelation of the other, and when he says other, he often means people, but also God, is granted us. We see their life, we see their suffering. Sometimes we misuse suffering to stir people up against the community, to spite the spirit, to harden ourselves against meaning and direction. The self becomes frozen in resentment. Instead of ascending the path, it allows itself to be seduced by powerlessness and plummets into darkness. Instead of peace with the world, there arises discord with the universe. Suffering is not a judgment, but a test. Its outcome lies in our hands. God is determined to lead us into suffering, and people must choose which path to take within it. Wow. That is big. I'd love to hear 2 or 3 folks just react to that. Like, what do you take from that? What do you take away from that? How does that move you? What does that mean to you? I love silence. Like, that's the only proper response to Heschel, right? What does that mean to you? Yeah, and Rona, your question is not one we can respond to. If God is omnipotent, what forces stand in God's way of preventing suffering? No way to answer. He calls that the dreadful mystery, right? Dreadful. Ugh. And yet seems to be part of the plan somehow. Okay, well, let's let that resonate. I think silence and stumpedness in the face of that, I think is a perfectly acceptable response. But the thing I think that strikes me about that is just this idea that when we are in calamity, trying to I always, like, when I'm in calamity, I want to get through it so I can find my own normalcy on the other side. And Heschel's like, it's not normalcy on the other side you're looking for. What's on the other side is other people and their suffering. And you can meet them there in that embrace of community. Ah, God, which is like exactly what we're doing right now, right? We're all here together. We are all suffering in different degrees, but all of us a lot, right? Right now, in some more acute than others, but all a lot. But here we are, connecting. Jackie.
I was just going to say there's also such a parallel to saying Kaddish when you think about that. We're all on a grief journey perhaps, but we're in community when we do it. So there is something so profound about, like you say, the other side being other people and the community one can feel, like you say, whether it's a grief journey or whether it's what's going on right now, excuse me, just being together with other people, sharing where we're at and how we're feeling. It's powerful.
It is powerful. And I think it's not an accident that you cannot say Kaddish alone, right? You cannot suffer. We do suffer alone, but our system says move towards suffering and joining in that pain. Hello, my friend. You don't have your name on there, but I'd love to call on you. With a white t-shirt and a blue thing there.
I think he's talking to Harold. Is that you?
Hi, Harold. Hi, Harold.
Okay.
Hi, there it is. Hi, Harold.
So suffering gives the opportunity for transcendence, to lead you to a place of anger or unconnectedness versus becoming part of a wider community, transcending and understanding the suffering, sharing it with others who are also going through it, transcending and in some way becoming something more in the process.
It's beautiful, and I'll just amplify that a step further. My other hero besides Abraham Joshua Heschel is Brené Brown. If you have not been listening to everything she has to say about trauma and shame, now's the time to listen to everything she has to say about trauma and shame. There is not one episode of anything she's done that I haven't walked away from like trembling with like feeling and excitement about what her approach opens up. But one thing she says, Harold, which I think resonates nicely with what you're saying, is just this idea that like shame, that suffering can lead to isolation, and isolation can lead to to people kind of falling apart. And that if this, I would just go on to say that if this country is going to have a future, one of the things that we're going to need to do is find the fear that people are living in, and rather than push away, which certainly is a natural inclination, to find ways to say, like, to show that we see and we hear and we understand, and only then there's the possibility for transcendence. What that's going to look like, it's going to take a long time to figure that out, but it's good enough for Brené Brown, it's good enough for me. I'd love to end us, we're out of time, but I'd love to end with the final quadrant, acting. We talked about feeling, we talked about thinking. And Heschel warns that too much talking about justice gets us stuck. And I just wanted to give a shout out. If you scroll a little bit down on the page, you'll see a lovely picture of an alum of JCHS, that's Erel, on the phone that came from the J Weekly, and he's calling a senior citizen in a home. Earlier, when the pandemic started, JCHS's response to the pandemic was to put a bunch of things into action. So students were matched one-on-one with elders at the San Francisco campus for Jewish living, and they made these weekly friendship phone calls to their buddies. That's what Ariel is doing in that picture. Students volunteer, and to this day, they still do that. Right now, students at JCHS are volunteering to tutor students at the Oakland Hebrew Day School, writing Hebrew math and guitar, and they're being buddies for the and mentoring the K-8 students. And JCHS students are volunteering with the Village Project, which is a beloved after-school program here in the Western Addition. JCHS students are leading activities like music and science and sports. Zoe Skegan is quoted in the article talking about how she was connected with Judith Birnbaum, 76 years old, and they discovered that they both have a passion for San Francisco, and they're big fans of jazz singers Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald. And I read that and I just had this big smile, and it's like, wow, in the midst of all this suffering, I was picturing a student and a 76-year-old talking about Billie Holiday. I cannot imagine a lovelier thing than that. Maya is a big fan of, you're probably a big fan of both of them, am I right?
Oh, yes.
Maya's taste in music is impeccable. So I'd love to just end with a few final thoughts, and we'll say goodnight. Working on tonight's time together, I felt frequently emotional listening to Mr. Gonsalves' interpretation of Nachamu Nachamu. I definitely teared up. And then reading Heschel talk about God's suffering right along with us, I definitely teared up. And then that commandment to reach out and connect, there were more tears. And then I saw how JCHS teens were getting up and doing things, or in this case, sitting down and calling. My heart would stir and I would just feel like weepy and not just sad, but moved by all this human pain and the human capacity to feel and to long and to reach out and to comfort. And also I just felt overwhelmed by how far there is to go. That metaphor of the journey, right? These new shelter in place orders, just there was a light at the end of the tunnel. It just felt like it drifted away and everything felt so heavy. And putting this together, I also felt so proud of my culture and the way that we've weathered so many calamities over the ages. And then I read the news and the numbers are not good in this country, and we are in the midst of a calamity, loss of life, dashing of dreams, families torn apart. In my own family, as I mentioned, COVID has struck, as it has for many of you, and if not, our community suffers, our country, our world. And then, as if on cue, there was a knock on the door, and Gabby, my wife, came into the room, and she did the thing that Jews do best. She saw my sadness, and she gave me, I kid you not, a fresh baked chocolate chip cookie. It was prophetic. It was prophecy, better than Yirmiyahu. And it was really freaking good too. So what is there to do? We Jews do what we do. We give each other cookies. We read and we discuss. We come together. We do the sacred work. If not repairing the world, then comforting the sick and the bereaved. We find hope in the words of the sages. We take ourselves to task in ways that might have made Jeremiah proud, right? Our unpopular prophet who spoke inconvenient truth 2,500 years before the term was even coined. But most importantly, return to the people we love, our students, our school families, our own families, and we say the thing that one says when one sees a friend in sadness. We say, we see their sadness as a call to us. Their sadness says, Ayeka, where are you? The first question of the Bible, right? Their sadness says, Ayeka, where are you? Where are you, justice? Where are you, mercy? Where are you, God of kindness and compassion? And each of us can say in response, Hineni, I am here. Thank you so much for joining us, JCHS, and together tonight. I'm going to pass the microphone back to DJ.
Well, Evan, thank you so much. Thank you for inspiring us. The same way you've inspired so many students to come through the doors of JCHS for more than a decade now. We're so lucky to have you in our community. I really wish that I had a teacher growing up that was like you, but I'm honored to learn from you as an adult. I hope you have a wonderful winter holiday season, my friend. That wraps up another installment of Belonging Together. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight. It's always great to see parents here. It's great to see former parents. It's great to see former students. I hope you were inspired. I hope you were entertained. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. And I'd like to wish you an early Shabbat Shalom. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us. Have a great night.
Thank you so much for the gift of this session.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Good night.
So good to see you.